All right, I'd like to start part two of this lecture with looking at this overview of the time periods we've looked at. And I think this is a very helpful review of the different aspects compared across these three columns. So the first one is, what kind of things will you expect to see, right? And what form is it presented in? So traditional art periods, they represent imagery naturalistically. It's very representational. And as we move to Impressionism, they kind of challenge that approach, even though they keep aspects of it. And then by the time we get to Modernism, they totally reject this idea that imagery has to be either recognizable or painted or created in a traditional manner. So then also the social political landscape is different. So in traditional art, we have a rural and agrarian culture where the artistic patronage is in the wealthy institutions, the church, the state, or wealthy individuals. Whereas in Impressionism, it's much more urban, city life, what's happening in the city. And then there is this artistic independence that it's left the confines of the academy and painting for the wealthy. And it moves into a different form of support, of patron support. So there may be mentors, but now we have a lot of collectors and galleries selling the art, representing artists to the wealthy and middle class. The middle class are now able to afford artworks, and they can go to a gallery to purchase the work of an artist under the recommendation of that gallery owner. And then when we get to Modernism, the artist is completely independent, although it's still represented by galleries and collectors, and it's very much market driven. If the reviewer or the curator says this is a good work, or the art critic says it's a good work, it will drive up the market and you will be able to sell your work. If you're not the person who is in the forefront at this time with your ideas and your work, you may have a harder time surviving. There's a transition from the artsman as a craftsman, someone who knows and studies how to paint, who is trained in a particular method, to someone who's free to experiment, who's much more creative. And then finally, in Modernism, we have this idea here that the artist is a creative individual. He's an innovator. He comes up with the newest ideas. He is the new leader in the avant-garde. And the word avant-garde shows up here as someone who challenges conventions, who is the forefront of the new movement in art. Subject matter, we know, is chosen and based in traditional artwork on historical events, on art, on written works that have religious or political meaning to the culture, based on either biblical or mythological stories and writings. During the transitional period, we've also already mentioned that it's 19th century life that's important. And when we get to Modernism, because they reject all of this connection to historical content and recognizable imagery, what we see in Modernism is this idea of art for art's sake, which just means the making of art, the producing of art, the basic elements of art are what's important. Traditional art reinforces the values of the culture, reinforces the power of the wealthy, the king. Transitional art jumps in and helps the breakdown of that power. It challenges traditional values, and it makes plain what underlying values are hidden. So I'm thinking about the idea of Manet painting a Olympia using a prostitute for that mythological figure. And then in Modernism, is only one way to paint. There's only one thing to work at, and that is the purification of art and the multiple ways it can be done to get at this essence of art. The purpose for traditional art is for the enjoyment of the aristocracy, both sacred and secular, but also this idea of value reinforcing to maintain their power and control. In the transitional period, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, we have it purely for the enjoyment of the middle classes and the enjoyment or creativeness of the artists themselves. And then in modernism, we return to this idea that only the wealthy either understand the art or can afford to buy it. They must be educated, be reading the critic, understanding what the context is for these artworks in order to enjoy it. And here we get the separation. Well, actually, we get it a little bit earlier, but this idea that popular art, movies, calendars, any kind of entertainment is for the lower classes. And then finally, I gave some examples that you can look up that we have covered in our past modules and lectures. So first, I've talked a little bit about modernism, and modernism has multiple smaller movements underneath it. And so I am going to start here with abstract expressionism. Since modernism rejects any imagery, the subject matter is that actual act of painting and the paint itself, how you can put it on the surface, how you can create motion with it, how you can express your feelings with it, how you can represent experiences with the actual paint. It's the gesture of the brush and the artist that communicates the expressiveness of these colors and these spaces, which would be very flat, two-dimensional spaces that are being created. In abstract expressionism and modernism, canvases get larger and larger and larger until you feel like they take over a room. During Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and even a little bit earlier in Realism and Neoclassicism, when middle class people were buying their paintings, they could not buy these huge paintings. So the size tended to be much smaller. And as we got into modernism, this use of huge sizes kind of exploded so that the imagery, which is the paint and the color and the line and the motion, were right up front on the surface. So the emphasis is on the picture plane. They did not want you to feel like there was depth. And some artists worked very, very hard to get rid of this feeling of space and depth. Here's another example, much different. This is Kandinsky, and he used much more rationalistic approach to color and shapes and line. So they were much more geometric and hard edge, and they're a little bit more about compositional design and rhythm than about actual storytelling or an actual emotion that would come across. This is much more design based, and the enjoyment is purely for tension between unity and variety. The emphasis on various elements of art made artists kind of reduce and reduce and reduce to very base forms, and out of that comes this idea of what we call minimalism. And so, like I said, it's the formal elements that are the emphasis. And the idea is creating pure forms that are detached from subject matter or emotions. These two pieces are very minimalistic, where you just have a black square on a white surface. Or you have a minimalist sculpture, which is just a single monolithic form with light. So value, shape is all that's working here. And there is no expectation that you react to it or understand it for the thing itself, for the things that you view, but that you need to understand the background there. So there should be no subject matter, no emotions. And this should remind you of the example that I showed you in the different point of view lecture on modernism. We had that artwork that was pure blue, and Ellis talked about wanting it to have no form, no function, and that you could just lose yourself in it. So everything tends to be much more hard-edged, geometric, because these things are more rational. There's no creative hand. I couldn't tell you if a machine did this or it was handmade. They don't want the artist to show himself at all. And this is kind of a reaction to Jackson Pollock and the abstract expressionists, where it was all about the presence of the artist in the marks that they made on the canvas. Now, out of this comes something else that's called conceptual art. The subject matter of conceptual art are the ideas and concepts that were thought through to make the art. So people who became conceptual artists, and here's an example, 1 and 3 chairs, They're giving the idea, what is really the artwork? Is it the idea behind the shape as a chair? Or is it an artwork in itself? So they started showing the ideas behind something in text and words and connecting it to the outcome, which was the artwork. Sometimes conceptual artists, you will go and see a show on conceptual art, and what you will get will it be his whole process, like where the idea started, what modifications they made to it, what drawings they did, and then finally the outcome isn't as important as the whole creative process. So that's also part of conceptual art.